Welcome back to Real Presence Live. This is Father Richard Kunst coming to you from the Diocese of Duluth, and my stand-in co-host is Hillary Hauer, and we are now about to have a conversation with Jason Adkins, who is the Executive Director of the Minnesota Catholic Conference. Did I say that correctly? Anyhow, so tell us, Jason, a little bit about your what you do as your role as Executive Director of Minnesota Catholic Conference.
So the Minnesota Catholic Conference is not an event. It is the Conference of Bishops. And so the bishops of Minnesota gathered together to discuss important matters of common interest to all the dioceses, and one of the most important of those is public policy matters. So our staff here work to bring the bishops' legislative initiatives to the state capitol and to our congressional representatives, and then help them make contact with our elected officials and talk about important issues that promote human dignity and protect the common good here in Minnesota. And then we also help lay Catholics be faithful citizens and live that call to faithful citizenship, and help amplify the voice of the bishops in the public square by connecting them with their legislators through our Catholic advocacy network. So it's really public policy focused.
Very important work, especially in the state of Minnesota when we have the party that leads everything in the state of Minnesota, very contrary to a lot of things that we stand for. So the thing that's got to be an extra challenge for you in your role, but the big bill coming up right now is the whole physician-assisted suicide. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yes, our role and responsibility is always to work with elected officials in both parties to find common ground for the common good. Not every issue lines up along strict partisan lines one way or another. And in one example, that is physician-assisted suicide, where we are part of a broad coalition called the Alliance for Ethical Healthcare, made up of doctors, healthcare advocates, people concerned about disparities in healthcare delivery, veterans groups, disability groups, all opposing assisted suicide and instead promoting better health care. In the state with some of the best health care in the country, let alone perhaps even the world, we should be promoting better care, finding better ways to care for one another, and not hastening death through assisted suicide. And what that legislation would do is it would require doctors and healthcare professionals who work with or nurse practitioners who work with terminally ill patients to offer them the option of receiving a lethal dose of drugs, and then they would take those home and ingest those. And that would be what we call assisted suicide. And it really is coercive, of course, on the role of healthcare professionals. It turns the healing profession into one that hastens death. And we think that protecting the supposed choices of some who want assisted suicide will actually end up endangering the healthcare choices of all the rest of us. When care is expensive and killing is cheap, which do we think will prevail? So we are deeply concerned about the potential legalization of physician-assisted suicide, but I am pleased to report that the opposition to this is strong and it is bipartisan. So we are grateful for that.
Jason, I took some time to read through this bill, and I've got to say there's layers upon layers upon layers. Can you explain, I guess this is a twofold question. Number one, the importance of truly understanding all of the layers that are within this bill, and also how those layers could actually open the door to this bill being expanded beyond this original version at some point in time, meaning questions like what does terminal mean, or what does attending provider mean, and all of these layers. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, obviously with such a dangerous policy proposal, legislators want to make sure, and the public wants to make sure that, of course, there are quote-unquote safeguards in place to protect against things such as elder abuse, for example. And so proponents of this legislation will say, oh, well, we've put in all these safeguards to make sure that, there's informed consent and that there's not going to be issues of abuse and things like that. But there are actually very, very few safeguards. And then what we see in place after place where it's legal is once it's legalized, the proponents go back and try to remove the safeguards to promote access. The other potential danger of assisted suicide legislation is that it starts with a narrower population of eligible persons. In this case, people with a terminal diagnosis, meaning they have fewer than 6 months to live. But as we've seen in places over and over, including our neighbor to the north in Canada, the eligible populations gradually expand. Canada just put on hold a change in their law, for example, that was supposed to go into effect March 21st, that would allow people with mental illness to be eligible to receive assisted suicide, which I think just on the face of it, most would find horrific. But ever since there was legalization of assisted suicide in Canada in 2016, the group of eligible populations has continued to expand. There's even now in places like Belgium, there's now even involuntary euthanasia of minors if the parents consent. So it's really a slippery slope that's not just a slope, but really a cliff. And it's very dangerous, but you're right in pointing out that we need to understand what safeguards are there and what safeguards are not there, and then how the eligible populations will eventually expand. There's no way that and let me put it this way, we would be naive to think that this is going to be limited only to terminal patients going forward if it were legalized here in Minnesota.
I think that evil twists its ways to its own purposes. I sit back as the priest and I think to myself, this is demonic. I mean, especially how you talk about the slippery slope and how this expands, and it's like we're death. It's with John Paul II, the whole party. The whole culture of death thing is so rampant here. Let me ask you this specifically: does this bill allow for, as it's being proposed right now, a conscience clause? What if you're a faithful Catholic doctor or working in the medical field and this bill gets passed? I mean, where is that?
So in terms of conscience clauses, doctors and nurse practitioners do not have to prescribe the lethal dose of drugs, nor do they have to be participants as part of the attending physicians or the confirming physicians or healthcare providers, nor do pharmacists. Are they required to administer the prescription themselves? But what's challenging and troubling is that under this law, the legal standard of care in Minnesota will be that all nurse practitioners and doctors who work with terminal patients will be required to offer them as a treatment option. So that will be part of the standard of care. So even if you don't actually prescribe, you will be compelled to offer this as one treatment option and give the patient information about this. Of course, we know that we don't live in a system with family doctors anymore, and you only see one doctor. You are typically dealing with a care team and care professionals. So will patients who have terminal diagnoses, which we know are often people outlive them. They're not often accurate. We know people who've been in and out of hospice care. So that is even tenuous. But the reality is that patients might be in the position where doctors are continually coming into their room or into an appointment and offering them assisted suicide. How is that not going to be coercive on the patient? Are people going to feel like the quote-unquote right to die is going to become the duty to die, with people reminding them that they have this option all the time to end themselves? So it's deeply troubling. It's going to sow mistrust between patient and doctor, and it's going to turn the healthcare profession, which is about restoration and healing, on its head and make them agents of death. And that's why so many doctors and healthcare practitioners are proactively speaking out against this troubling bill.
Jason, I might be wrong here, but is it 10 states plus Washington, D.C. allow physician-assisted suicide? Mm-hmm. Okay. And I'm just curious if there's any language or talk within the committee that just happened, that it passed the House Health Committee on January 25th, about the view of suffering. Like how prevalent is the secular view of suffering and all of the discussions that are happening in these committees?
Well, I think it's important to note that pain and fear of pain and pain management is not the primary reason why people choose assisted suicide in other states. It's fear of being a burden. It's fear of losing autonomy. And in fact, it says a lot about persons with disabilities that, people who live dependent on others, their lives are supposedly not worth living. And that's why persons with disabilities are concerned about this, and why they feel acutely the way in which this law will shape the morality of our society and our culture, is that people who will lead supposedly undignified lives if they're dependent on others are going to have this option of ending their life. What does that say about the lives of others who are dependent on people for their day-to-day life? And that's why some of our strongest advocates are those with disability, people with disability, and those who care for them. So it's really, really troubling from that perspective and that impact. I think there's one misconception, though, that also needs to be put to bed, that the Catholic position or the opposition to assisted suicide is not rooted in this idea that we have to prolong life at all costs. Everyone has the right to receive and refuse health care. We don't have to be hooked up to every extraordinary treatment, and that's basic Catholic teaching around end-of-life care. But we are the stewards of the gift of life and have to respect that and treat our bodies and preserve our health within reasonable limitations. And so we don't have to go on and prolong suffering. You can cease receiving, withdraw, or withhold certain types of care. And we have tools that can help us manage these decisions and these challenges at the end of life. That's why at the Minnesota Catholic Conference at our website, mncatholic.org, we offer a guide to end-of-life decision-making and also a healthcare directive, so you can assign someone as a healthcare agent or put out through an advanced directive your wishes about how you wish to receive end-of-life care consistent with Catholic teaching and sound ethical principles. So it's really important that it's not a question of do we prolong life at all costs or do we hasten death to end suffering. It's really about how do we steward our gift of life effectively with ethical principles in light of the Church's teaching and in light of the fact that we are not the authors and ultimate authorities about when life begins and when life ends.
Jason, in 45 seconds that we have left, say what our listeners can do to get involved. You got about 38 seconds.
mncatholic.org is our website, mncatholic.org. You can join the Catholic Advocacy Network to be updated on important issues, and with a click of the button, take action and send a message to your legislators. People who want to know more about the assisted suicide legislation, our broad coalition can go to ethicalcaremn.org. That's ethicalcaremn.org. That is the broad and diverse bipartisan alliance for ethical healthcare. There's all sorts of resources and information about the assisted suicide issue and ways people can get informed and they can get involved. Again, that's at ethicalcaremn.org.
Thank you very much, Jason. You're doing God's work. Keep it up. We need you here in the state of Minnesota.